So guys, we've officially rolled over into a new decade, and so what I thought we'd do today is take a look back at some of the best shooter games that defined the last one. The games that, in a nutshell, are the reason that I'm here and making this video in the first place. So guys, this is BillyEatWorld again, and here's my top 10. Alright guys, welcome to the video, and just before we start I want to set a few ground rules because I want this list to be a snapshot of all of the great FPS games that I've played over the last 10 years. And so firstly, I'm going to have to set a limit of one game per franchise, which I've got to admit is actually pretty hard because sometimes it's really hard to nail down a favorite. Also, and this is really important for you guys to remember, this is my top 10. I'm not basing this on what I think other people like, so there's a good chance that you might disagree with the order of this list. So look, if you've got a different top 10, well, that's fine. As always, make sure you leave it down below because I'd love to take a look. But anyway, let's get into it. Number 10, CRYSIS 3, the most recent installment in a franchise which takes the futuristic suit shooter to the next level. And sure, it's still a fairly linear and arcadey experience, but rather than just the typical guns blazing style gameplay, this game gives you a bunch of options to take a more stealthy approach. You can use your suit to either armor up or to cloak, and you can customize your weapons with attachments depending on whether you want to stay quiet or go loud. But most importantly, the main reason it makes this list is because for its time it looked absolutely stunning, and it still does, even compared to modern games. Number 9, Halo Reach, which in my opinion isn't the best game in this legendary franchise, but it's definitely my favourite that was released in the last decade. And I think that was because it took a different approach from the previous games. It doesn't focus on Master Chief, but instead on another team of Spartans as they defend the planet Reach from a Covenant invasion. Most importantly though, Halo was always a shooter franchise that felt a bit different, and Reach took that classic style gameplay and made it feel a bit more modern. And that, along with the fact that it was recently remastered in the Master Chief Collection, makes it one of the easiest Halo games to jump back into in 2020. Number 8, Borderlands 2, which I know a lot of people would rate a little bit higher than I do because it's one of, and if not the best, arcadey loot shooters ever made. And that's exactly why it's not higher on my list. Don't get me wrong, it does what it does perfectly. That's just not the sort of thing I normally choose to play. But with that being said though, there's no denying its cartoony, cel-shaded art style and quirky cast of characters is a recipe for one of the most unique experiences you'll ever have with a shooter game. And most importantly, it's got almost limitless replayability. It's an open world game with randomized weapons and gear, and one that you can explore with friends in online co-op. Number 7, Doom, the reboot of the legendary suit shooter franchise that started it all way back in the early 90s, and a game with a massive legacy to live up to. Which honestly, I think it does. It's just as fast-paced and classic as the older games, but it's also still slick and smooth enough to survive in the modern era. Just like the old games, it's still pretty linear and the story is still pretty average, but it's challenging and it's visceral, and most importantly, it looks insanely polished even for 2016. And once again, the only reason it's not higher on this list is because that's not really the sort of game I'm usually into, but I know a lot of people would completely disagree. Number 6, Call of Duty Black Ops. And look, if you're watching this video, you know this game needs no introduction. It was the COD game which followed Modern Warfare 2 and somehow managed to be almost as good. And even though it's a style of game many of us playing military shooters now have moved on from, it was one that back then made us fall in love with this genre. I think for me, the standout thing was the fact that the campaign was set in the Cold War and threw you into famous real-world events like the Vietnam War with authentic weapons and gear. But obviously, the thing that most people remember was the multiplayer. Once again, a style of multiplayer that I've grown out of, but obviously looking at the subsequent success of the franchise, one that clearly many people haven't. Number 5, Far Cry 3. Which was the first breakout hit for this franchise, and one of the first open world shooters that I think really did a good job of blending in RPG elements. I mean, we'd already seen games like Fallout 3, but they were always RPG first, first-person shooter second, and Far Cry 3 turned that all around. Also, it was set in a tropical paradise, something completely different from all the modern and futuristic military shooters around at the time. And you don't play as some super soldier either. Essentially, it's the journey of a regular guy surviving, exploring, and eventually taking over an exotic and deadly new world. Number 4, Squad, which is one of the few games that I force myself not to play sometimes because I find it so addictive that I just can't stop. It's the spiritual successor of the Project Reality mod for Battlefield 2, which was and still is one of the best large-scale tactical shooters that was ever created. Squad isn't about running in and getting kills. Half the fun comes from communicating and working with your team, which by the way can be up to 50 players strong. It's the type of game that's so big and so complex that you can get one kill in a game and still feel like you've had a good time. And that's something you really can't say about just about every other shooter. Number 3, Fallout 4. Yet another futuristic suit shooter, except that, like Far Cry 3, it's another game which blends the FPS genre together with the open world RPG format. Except that unlike its previous games in the franchise, Fallout 4 really tries hard to feel like a modern shooter as well as an RPG, something which many veteran players actually criticize it for. What can I say though, it's still insanely fun. It almost feels like you can do anything in this game. Loot hunting, faction building, crafting, it's just a trap for hundreds or even thousands of hours of your time. And when you're sick of the vanilla content, well, there's a massive modding community pumping out even more stuff to suck up even more of your life. Number 2, Insurgency. And if you're a fan of this channel, well, this should be no surprise, right? It's a game which has essentially changed my taste in shooter games. And that's because it's kind of like a blend of Counter-Strike and Battlefield, but it's designed to be super hardcore and a lot more immersive, something which I now look for in just about every game that I play. You'll notice it's not as slick looking as a lot of games on this list, especially considering it came out in 2014, but anyone who's played it will tell you that that doesn't matter. It's all about the gameplay. It's fast, it's brutal, and it's raw. And most importantly, it's unbelievably challenging even for the best players. Now, just before we get on to the number 1 slot, I just want to give an honorable mention to Black Mesa, which is essentially the 2012 remake of the classic FPS game Half-Life. And look, if it wasn't for the fact the original game came out in 1998, and the fact that Black Mesa technically still isn't finished, it'd definitely be in the top 10 for sure. If you've never played Half-Life before, you have to do it. It was groundbreaking for its time, and it was one of the first games to show you could actually have a decent storyline in a first-person shooter game. And Black Mesa essentially updates the game enough so that modern players will enjoy the game even in 2020. Sure, it's still a little dated compared to some of the games on this list, but man, it's still so damn good. But finally, number 1, Battlefield 3, which is a game that I'll always have a soft spot for because it's probably the first shooter game that I can remember ever getting seriously addicted to. I mean, I'd played military shooter games ever since I was a kid, and like I said before, I was a fan of Call of Duty, but Battlefield 3 was all of that and then a lot more. For the time, it was one of the largest scale multiplayer shooters I'd ever played, but not just that, unlike previous Battlefield games, it felt like playing as infantry, armor, or air was equally as smooth. And so that's why fast forward 9 years, I'm still addicted to Battlefield. It wasn't the first one that I'd played, but for me, it's the one that I'll always keep going back to. But anyway, guys, that just about wraps up this top 10. So as always, make sure you let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And like I said before, if you've got a completely different top 10, that's completely fine. Let me know what you think down below because I'd love to take a look. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And don't forget, you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later and have a good one.